Welcome to Tanya in 5. Today we're doing something a little bit different. You see, the Tanya could be divided into many sections. The first section goes from chapter 1 through 17, then from 18 through 25, then from 26 through 34, then 35 through 40, and then 41 through 50, and then the last section, 51, 52, and 53. Now, what I'd like to do is, at the end of each of these sections, I'd like to do a quick run through all the chapters of the preceding section. And hopefully this will help us see the flow from one section to the next and how the Tanya builds its case for our life journey. And this we're going to call Tanya on 1 foot. So, welcome to Tanya on 1 foot. Today we're going to run through chapter 1 through 17. In chapter 1, we establish that every Jew has 2 souls. The first soul is the natural, biological, self-centered person. And this, the Alter Rebbe calls the animal soul. Chapter 2, we get to the godly soul, the divine soul. And we discuss the divine soul's DNA, that no matter what kind of Jew a person might be, at the core, their spiritual DNA is a part of God. Chapter 3, we get to the godly soul's personality, its mind, understanding and perceiving godliness, and its heart, attachment and awe of God. Chapter 4, we get to what the godly soul does with all of these feelings of attachment for God. It invests it in the performance of mitzvot, of divine desire as expressed in Torah, through thought, speech, and action. Chapter 5, we discuss this unique quality of Torah in that when I study Torah, I am engaged in it, but moreover, when I understand Torah, it is then inside me. So godliness resides within my mind as I understand and comprehend Torah. Chapter 6, we move over to the animal soul. Now, the animal soul is essentially not godly. So what does it mean that something is not godly? Well, to start with, there is a sin. The sin is in opposition to God. It's what God does not want, so certainly that's not godly. But then in chapter 7, we get to, what about all those things that are not godly, because they're not a mitzvah, but they aren't antithetical to godliness? They aren't a sin either. Say, eating kosher food, sleeping, drinking. These are all natural enough things. They aren't sin, but they aren't mitzvah. So, explains the Alter Rebbe that this too is not godly. This too is animal soul. I'm eating because I'm hungry. But because it isn't a sin, it could go in a few directions. Number 1, I could eat it just because I want to survive, and in which case it remains just an ungodly activity. Or I can eat, sleep, drink for overindulgence, in which case I have upped the ante on the selfishness and thus moved it farther away from God, almost becoming, at least temporarily, antagonistic to godliness because it became about me. Or I can eat, sleep, and drink with the intention that I want to serve God later with the energy that I acquire from that eating, sleeping, and drinking or any other kosher activity, in which case this is elevated. So the ungodliness of the animal soul isn't evil per se. It is in this realm where it's selfish, but it could be used in the service of God. In chapter 8, the Alter Rebbe explained to us the consequences of doing and acting and thinking or learning in such a way that is ungodly. It leaves a mark on the soul, it leaves a mark on the body, and thus the body and soul have to go through cleansing in life after death. In chapter 9, the Alter Rebbe explained the struggle between these 2 souls. The godly soul is in the mind because it's out for what is the truth, what does God want, whereas the animal soul is in the heart because it's out for the self, what do I want? And there's the competition. Do what I want or do what God wants. In chapter 10, we describe the tzaddik, the one who's so enthralled and so taken by the beauty of godliness and by the awe of godliness that his very instinct is to do nothing other than serve God. Never mind in thought, speech, and action. Certainly there he's doing only what God wants, but even in his very instinct and his desire, his attachments are only towards God. In chapter 11, we described the Rasha, the wicked one. This is anyone essentially who is capable of doing anything that is not in accord with Torah law. If I am capable of doing something that Torah says not to, then essentially I would be a Rasha because I am capable of violating God's command. In chapter 12, we're introduced to the Benoni. The Beinoni is the ultimate disciplinarian. He's exactly like the Rasha in terms of his feelings. He desires things like every other human being on the planet, which sometimes include desiring sin. But he has a very strong sense of discipline. The mind controls the heart, and therefore, even if he truly wants to do something he's not supposed to, he will not. He always controls himself and makes sure that in thought, speech, and action, he is following exactly God's command as expressed in Torah. In chapter 13, we talked about the Beinoni's prayer. It's true, the Beinoni may ordinarily, like we just said, feel and desire things that are ungodly, but the Beinoni puts a lot of effort that at least during his prayer time, he contemplates and thinks about the greatness of God, so that at least during prayer he feels attached to God. Even if after prayer that attachment kind of wanes and he goes back to feeling like every other person in the world which has selfish desires, but at least during prayer he's elevated to feel attachment and love of God. And the feeling he feels during prayer inspires him in his fight for discipline throughout the rest of the day. In chapter 14, the Alter Rebbe tells us that each of us should strive to be the Beinoni, because even if we cannot change our emotions, because that would be like a tzaddik whose emotions are only towards God, but we certainly can control our thought, speech, and action. At every moment we can always decide, do I want to do something? Do I not want to do something? And therefore, that is what we are looking for, to attain complete mastery and self-control over our thoughts, speech, and action. Then in chapter 15 says the Alter Rebbe, this internal struggle to fight my urges that want to do sin and contain them, or to fight my laziness that doesn't want to do a mitzvah and make myself do a mitzvah, that internal fight is what defines the essence of the Beinoni. And therefore, someone who finds himself complacent, I do everything God wants, leave me alone. He may technically be a Beinoni because he isn't violating any of Torah law, but could you call this person truly a Beinoni? Not really, because a Beinoni is all about someone who puts up a fight, and this person's complacent. And what this person has to do is define his comfort zone and push it so he can truly be in the fight and truly be a Beinoni. In chapter 16, the Alter Rebbe told us a big part of the Beinoni, as we discussed in chapter 13, is his prayer. He contemplates God's greatness, and at least during prayer feels an emotional attachment. What if the person understands God's greatness, but for some reason cannot get that emotional attachment? What does this person do? Says the Alter Rebbe, what you should do is, you should consider, how should I feel based on what I understand of godliness? And make a deep resolution in my mind. Because I ought to feel love for God, therefore I'm going to act as if I do. And therefore I act upon my resolution of how I would behave had I felt, even if I don't actually feel. And finally in chapter 17, says the Alter Rebbe, that this therefore is why serving God is attainable for every single person. Because even if I cannot control my heart, I can control my mind. I could decide what I want to think about, and I could decide to think about God's greatness. And I could also control myself. I could always control my thought, speech, and action. Now, this ends this section of Tanya. The next section from chapter 18 through 25, the Alter Rebbe is going to discuss another path to feeling attachment for God. Because the attachment for God described in the preceding chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, depend on the person's capacity to contemplate and understand God's greatness. So even if he doesn't feel for it, at least he can come to the conclusion, I ought to feel for it. But what about a person who is incapable and doesn't have the mind to be able to understand God's greatness, or to come to any sort of learning and understanding of God's beauty to be able to say, I ought to love God? He doesn't even have that. What does this person do? And therefore, in chapter 18 through 25, the Alter Rebbe is going to take us on a journey of how a person and a Jew can reach into their heart and find the existential attachment they already have for God, and use that to motivate their behavior. And that's coming after we conclude chapter 25.